Don't be bullshitting people. Like I say, there's enough bullshit as it is. There's enough bullshit as it is. In fact, there's just enough. Did you know that? There's just enough bullshit to hold things together in this country. Bullshit is the glue that binds us as a nation. Where would we be without our safe, familiar American bullshit? Land of the free, home of the brave, the American dream. All men are equal, justice is blind, the press is free, your vote counts.
The world is running out of oil. In a few short years, prices will skyrocket as resources dwindle. Our entire way of life will face catastrophic upheaval. Civilization as we know it could collapse. This is the peak oil narrative, and today we're on the very cusp of peak oil. But wait, we already passed that point in 1973. The last video covered the history of the oil industry in brief and the 1973 energy crisis. This crisis was predicted, or so it is claimed, by an American geophysicist named M. King Hubbard. In a National Academy of Sciences report on energy resources, which was sent to the U.S. government itself, under the direction of John F. Kennedy, who asked for such a report. We're going to rely on Wikipedia for our definition. The Hubbard peak theory says that for any given geographical area from an oil-producing region to the planet as a whole, the rate of petroleum production tends to follow a bell-shaped curve. The Hubbard peak theory is based on the observation that the amount of oil under the ground in any region is finite. Therefore, the rate of discovery, which initially increases quickly, must reach a maximum and decline. In the US, oil extraction followed the discovery curve after a lag time of 32 to 35 years. Hubbard's peak was thought to have been achieved in the United States' contiguous 48 states in the early 1970s. Yet recent advances in extraction technology, particularly those that led to the extraction of tight oil and oil from shale, have drastically changed the picture. And in 2017, the United States once again passed the 1970s peak. This has led to, as far as I can see, hyperbolic claims of peak oil from both sides of the aisle, from George Bush in the early 2004 peak oil to 2020. We're at peak oil probably this very day.
Peak oil, in my mind, is essentially an inventory measure where you're going to put in the numerator the total amount of barrels that the world has, and the denominator the rate that the globe uses oil and gas supplies. And the actual initial work that was kind of is credited mostly was done by E. King Hubbard at Shell Oil back in, I believe, the 1960s. And at the time, he correctly predicted the peak in U.S. oil production. And using his data, a lot of folks thought that the peak in U.S. global oil production was going to happen in the 2004 to 2009 time period. Of course, it's going to take a number of years beyond that period for us to really assess if it truly happened.
So given that it's been on the minds of people for the last 40 years, is it something that's imminent or looming? Is it something that we really need to plan for? Are governments around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, no one wants to wake up and find that
we have no more.
Exactly.
Or from this site here, the Post-Carbon Institute. I don't know if they're credible or reliable, if they have any sort of following, but they do have some crazy disinformation, such as we're here, peak oil, year 2000, 1970, we were also here on this very peak. This chart actually makes no sense compared to the other graphs you'll be seeing today. According to the Post-Carbon Institute, we're going to see some major lifestyle changes in our time. We can't keep driving the way we do. We have 1.2 billion cars in the world, which is crazy. That's a scientific term. Even if every single car was electric, there's so much embedded energy in building the cars, the road systems, the infrastructure. More energy embedded in those things than you'd use in the life of a car. The system we've created, the one we continue to build upon and need to maintain, eats up a significant amount of oil. We can't keep going in this direction. So what's the solution? Relocalization will be a big piece of it. We need to live closer together with mass transit and other ways of moving around, living much closer to where we work or go to school. With the rise of suburbia, we've got used to the idea of spreading out, of using the car to go everywhere. But we'll need to condense things significantly. The US is in a tough position because we're one of the most energy intensive countries in the world. So we're the ones who will need to decrease our usage most drastically. The problem is, we believe it's our right to use it. We don't want to change. Our society can handle about a 10% voluntary energy reduction across the boards, doing things like walking more and carpooling. To get to the necessary level, which by some estimations will be about a 60 to 80% decrease in energy usage, will be impossible unless we change the way we think about things. We're not going to get to where we need to be by picking paper bags instead of plastic at the grocery store. The Post-Carbon Institute sees peak oil as a key driver of change to lower CO2 emissions and accomplish their goals. They just wish it had happened sooner. When we looked at the 1973 oil crisis in the last video, the text focused on the causes being kickbacks to Middle Eastern governments, particularly Libya, and internal collusion and monopoly between the different oil companies. The modern understanding of the 1973 oil crisis is the OPEC, the Middle Eastern petroleum exporting countries, proclaiming an oil embargo on the USA in retaliation for supporting Israeli in the Yom Kippur War. Now, there's another set of definitions we're going to need to learn here, and that is the 3 Ps that measure oil reserves. And those 3 Ps are proven, probable, and possible oil reserves. The definitions seem to change depending on where you're getting them sourced from. Probable and possible oil reserves are classified as unproven reserves. Both in 1973, the early 2000s, 2010, 2020, 2030, there's prediction after prediction that we'd reach peak oil, find the majority of the oil, and the ability to find more oil would steadily decline. Quote from Wikipedia, determining a more specific range is difficult due to the lack of certainty over the actual size of world oil reserves. Various universities have published papers saying oil would peak in 2014, it would peak in 2015. Oh, well, it already peaked in 2005. No. Punching when will oil reserves run out into, well, Bing actually, borrowed laptop, says that oil will run out by 2052 and we might be able to stretch it to 2060. And there's actually a lot of estimates, as we've seen, that predict even before this that we'll run out of oil. Indeed, there seems to be a lot of hope that we'll run out of oil, even though that means moving on to coal. Now, the more you dig around into oil reserves, you figure out that they're really just tossing out numbers that are convenient at the time, and all of it is really meaningless, and that is because of something called contingent reserves. Contingent reserves are basically swept under the rug. They're not talked about. They're not put into any official estimates. They're kind of written off as being inaccessible. Well, we can't get them. There's no way we'll ever be able to develop these contingent reserves in 50 years when we're running out of energy and the world's in an economic crisis. It's bullshit.
Don't be bullshitting people.
An excellent resource for this is Understanding Contingent Resources by GLJ Petroleum Consultants. And here we find that not only are contingent resources another further source of oil, but then we have prospective resources, which are considered uneconomically impossible to get, undiscovered, and unrecoverable. For their definition, contingent resources are those quantities of petroleum given as of estimated as of a given date to be potentially recoverable from known accumulations using established technology or technology under development, but which are not currently considered to be commercially recoverable due to one or more contingencies, being basically how much it costs, how much effort they got to go to get them. So it's clear here that by just estimating proven resources, mostly, and then maybe a little potential and prospective and whatever, not prospective, probable, potential, all that bullshit. It's entirely a false economy. It's a myth that the public's largely being indoctrinated into, along the same lines of people who think that global warming, that CO2 means we're running out of oxygen. That's not what it means. There's nothing to do with oxygen in global warming theory. The theory of global warming is that changing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.02% to 0.04%, that will lead to global warming. Meanwhile, oxygen hovers somewhere around 20%. I mean, 100 to 500 times, is that? Something just ridiculous. So no, we're not running out of oxygen, and we're not running out of oil. For unconventional resource plays, contingent resources can quickly grow to volumes that dwarf reserves. But I'm not alone in thinking this. It's not just me saying something and expecting you to believe me. Let's look at a few headlines here. From the Engineering Forum for all engineering professionals, Peak Oil, a specimen case of apocalyptic thinking. Predictions of when we would run out of oil have been around for a century, but the idea that peak production was rapidly approaching and that it would be followed by a ruinous decline gained wider acceptance thanks to the work of M. King Hubbard, an American geologist who worked for Shell in Houston. And Shell, of course, featured prominently in our previous video. They had the backing of the Royal Navy, if you'll remember. In 1956, he predicted the U.S. oil output would reach its top in 1960s. In 1969, he placed it in the first half of the 1970s. By 1970, it apparently came, but it was well over his predictions, and then it came and went, and here we are today. In the year 2000, we are putting out more than double his predictions, and it's only grown since then, despite many geologists saying we would run out in the early 2000s. Quote the Engineering Forum, the author of this article at least, "The recent obsession with an imminent peak of oil extraction has all the marks of a catastrophist apocalyptic cult." In another headline, the head of Russia's number 2 oil producer, Yukos, said the country's proven oil and gas reserves were underestimated. Despite all of the oil they're producing, the proven reserves of oil-producing countries in the Middle East never seem to actually drop. Saddad al-Hussein, former head of exploration and production at Saudi Aramco, Abdullah S. Juma, president, director, and CEO of Saudi Aramco, states that the world has adequate reserves of conventional and non-conventional oil sources that will last for more than a century. In 2008, he pronounced that we have grossly underestimated mankind's ability to find new reserves of petroleum, as well as our capacity to raise recovery rates and tap fields once thought inaccessible or impossible to produce. He predicts that the world resources may total between 13 and 16 trillion barrels, and that we've only used about 1.1 trillion to date since about 1850 onwards. I do not believe, quote, I do not believe that the world has to worry about peak oil for a very long time. From the Royal Society of Chemistry, Petroleum Review article says global oil reserves are underestimated. The June issue of the authoritative journal Petroleum Review will publish an article by the Royal Society of Chemistry Chief Executive Richard Pike, a career petrochemicals industry executive, where he says that the world's oil reserves have been and still are being grossly underestimated, with profound implications for the global environment this century and beyond. But their issue with this is that means we're not doing enough to fight climate change, and that having oil means that, I don't know, we're just going to use it and destroy ourselves, and there's nothing we can do, apparently. He added, there is also anecdotal evidence that some countries are underreporting proven reserves to maintain a high oil price. Altogether, as a result, the world is understating the environmental challenge facing generations to come and appears unprepared for the difficult compromises that will have to be made. From Business Insider, peak oil is dead.
There seems to be a dearth of case studies or programs dedicated to what happens when this actually occurs.
Now, one theory that could explain all of this and really caught my attention during my research for this video is abiogenesis, or the abiogenic petroleum origin. The theory that petroleum derives from biogenic processes is held by the overwhelming majority of petroleum geologists. However, abiogenic theorists such as the late professor of astronomy, Thomas Gold, assert that oil may be a continually renewing abiotic product rather than a fossil fuel in limited supply. They hypothesize that if abiogenic petroleum resources are found and are quick to replenish, petroleum production will not decline. Now, abiotics are an important aspect of biology and ecology and are essentially any physical or chemical process that isn't created by a living organism. And so the abiogenic petroleum origin basically states that petroleum and natural gas are formed by inorganic means, or at least mainly formed by inorganic means, rather than the decomposition of organisms. And this theory says that hydrocarbons are formed deep in the Earth's mantle. And while you'll find many denials that this happens at all, they're also usually paired with the caveat that it just is small amounts and not largely measurable. So it doesn't happen at all and only happens a little bit. This production of abiogenic petroleum relies on the Fischer-Tropsch process, chemical reactions that happen. They catalyze basically hydrogen and carbon in the mantle into hydrocarbons. And this is actually how we liquefy coal and make synthetic lubrication and synthetic oils. Now, this theory was put forth and tested by Thomas Gold, a highly awarded geologist, climatologist, astrophysicist, astronomist, and his work seemed largely railroaded by, well, oil interests. Another notable counterculture scientist, Freeman Dyson, had this to say at Gold's eulogy.
A few months ago, I was at Cornell University celebrating the life of Tommy Gold, a famous astronomer who died at a ripe old age. He was famous as a heretic, promoting unpopular ideas that usually turned out to be right. Long ago, I was a guinea pig in Tommy's experiments on human hearing. He had a heretical idea that the human ear discriminates pitch by means of a set of tuned resonators with active electromechanical feedback. The experts in auditory physiology ignored his work because he didn't have a degree in physiology. Many years later, the experts discovered the two kinds of hair cells in the inner ear that actually do the feedback as Tommy had predicted. It took the experts 40 years to admit that he was right. Of course, I knew he was right because I'd seen him do the experiments. Later in his life, he promoted another heretical idea that the oil and natural gas in the ground come up from deep in the mantle of the earth and have nothing to do with biology. Again, the experts are sure he is wrong, and he didn't live long enough to change their minds. But just a few months ago, some chemists at the Carnegie Institution in Washington did a beautiful experiment in a diamond anvil cell. They mixed together tiny quantities of three things that we know exist in the mantle of the earth and observed them at the pressure and temperature appropriate to the mantle about 200 kilometers down. The three things were calcium carbonate, which is sedimentary rock, iron oxide, which is a component of igneous rock, and water. Those three things are certainly present when a slab of subducted ocean floor descends from a deep ocean trench into the mantle. The experiment shows that they react quickly to produce lots of methane, which is natural gas. So big quantities of natural gas certainly exist in the mantle. The chemist sent an email to Tommy Gold to tell him their result and got back a message that he had died 3 days earlier. Now that he's dead, we need more heretics to take his place.
There's a couple of good examples of Gold's work and the controversy that surrounded him. In May 1940, just as Hitler was commencing his advance in Belgium and France, Gold was sent to internment as an enemy alien by the British government. Gold spent most of his nearly 15 months of internment in a camp in Canada, after which he returned to England and re-entered Cambridge University, where he started studying physics. He started working in naval research and ground radar somehow. He got into that field after his internment camp period. There he constructed new radar systems, determined how landing craft could use radar to find the appropriate spots to land on D-Day, and figured out that the German Navy had put snorkels onto its U-boats. Gold was also a critic of the NASA space shuttle program. However, he was warned by NASA officials that if he testified to Congress about his concerns, that they would pull their support for him and stop funding his project. Senator Walter Mondale, Democrat, NASA administrators wrote that Gold should realize that being funded by the government and NASA is a privilege, and that it would make little sense for us to fund him as long as his views are what they are now, which was correct. Published by the Washington Post, November 1999, says maybe we should finally pay attention to Thomas Gold. He says the world has an endless supply of oil and gas. Gold, a Vienna-born physicist, cosmologist, and general scientific heavy lifter, founded and for many years directed the Cornell Center for Radiophysics and Space Research. In his 79 years, he's authored more than 280 scholarly papers on subjects ranging from astronomy to zoology. He's also a full-time heretic, periodically parachuting into some new scientific field and infuriating academic plotters there with some outlandishly bold new theory. More annoying, his theories usually turn out to be right. Worst of all, he thinks the orthodox have so gummed up the gates of knowledge that they were more open to breakthroughs 50 years ago. Harvard biologist Stephen Jay Gould has labeled Gold one of America's most iconoclastic scientists. In 1947, fresh from pioneering wartime work on the development of radar, he used his research into high-frequency receptors to publish an entirely new theory of mammalian hearing. Physiologists shrugged it off for 30 years until auditory technology evolved enough to prove him correct. In 1959, when everybody thought the surface of the moon was frozen lava, Gold decided that it was covered from dust from meteor impacts. Footprints of the Apollo astronauts will testify eternally that he was right about that too. In 1967, astronomers trashed his suggestion that energy pulsating in the distant universe was a signature of collapsing stars. The subsequent observation of pulsars won 2 other scientists a Nobel Prize and proved Gold correct. In 1992, he predicted that Martian meteorites might contain fossilized microbes. 4 years later, NASA announced the same thing. Now, those fossilized microbes, at least to my understanding of Abiogenesis, which was supposed to play possibly an early role in the creation of DNA and RNA through natural processes deep in the deep hot biosphere, as Gould's theory states, and that microscopic life force is fueled by an inexhaustible supply of petroleum constantly migrating outwards from the planet's volcanic core. Basically, it's making hydrocarbons in the heat and the pressure of the core. Now, doesn't sound so crazy to me. 8 years ago, when Gold was still developing his theory, some geologists were so incensed that they petitioned the government to remove all mention of it from the nation's library. It was an effort at book burning, pure and simple, Gold says. People need to understand, he says, that the long-held assumption that oil comes from the millennial composting of dinosaurs and ancient swamps has always been dubious, whatever the science books say. His theory of a deep hot biosphere doesn't just solve its contradictions, it sorts out the process of such minor matters as the origin of life.
I'm Conor Nixon. I'm a planetary scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. I study the atmospheric composition of the outer planets. Titan is Saturn's largest moon. It's actually the second largest moon in the solar system. And it's the only moon in the solar system that has a large and substantial atmosphere. And that atmosphere in some respects is really similar to that of the Earth, being composed mainly of nitrogen, but in other respects it's really different. It has methane as its second most abundant gas, and that takes the same role as water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere. It evaporates from the surface, it forms clouds, and then rains down again, and in fact forms lakes that we see at Titan's North Pole, including ethane and propane and all sorts of complex chemicals. We also see these vast dune fields at the equator, which are not made of silicates as they are on the Earth, but actually made of organic substances, essentially plastics, which have actually sedimented from the atmosphere and are being blown around into dune fields, the same as we'd see on a desert on the Earth. Some people think that Titan is similar to the prebiotic Earth long ago, when the molecules were forming the basis of life. And we don't know what we're going to find on Titan if we send back further spacecraft with new instruments, more sensitive instruments, if some of the molecules on Titan could be similar to the basis of life on Earth.